I think that all of us in business at the moment find ourselves in a very difficult situation. We all want to move forward and start to generate recovery and move forward with our business plans for 2021, but we are still stuck in this torrid situation of a very significant national lockdown, which may even get worse in the next few weeks. And even though we can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel in the post-vaccine era, that's still some way off. And most people thinking that any kind of normality won't really be there until probably May, June, or even the second half of the year. So I suppose that as far as the business environment is concerned, it's still really split into two key questions. How do we deal with the present, with the need to keep businesses alive and give them a bridge to the future? But then how do we move forward from this crisis and actually try to generate a sustainable recovery for the economy, which is so essential? Now, as far as the current situation is concerned, I mean, there's no doubt that government has really stepped in here to support business in an unprecedented way, and we've had a range of packages put in place which have played an absolutely crucial role. I think we all would agree that businesses large and small would have, at least in most sectors, would have had real problems getting through this crisis without crucial government support. And perhaps I could ask now for my slides to be put up on the screen, which provides something of a summary of where we are in different terms of support schemes. It's really quite to see the range of measures that have been implemented, ranging from the furlough scheme to a degree of forbearance by HMRC in terms of tax repayments, holidays on things like business rates, of course, the various loan schemes, government-backed loan schemes, which have been put in place, such as the CBIL scheme and the bounce back loan scheme. And all of those things, I think, have been tremendously important. There are, however, I think, two cautionary things to note about all of these schemes. The first is that, unfortunately, there are still some key groups of business people, key groups of entrepreneurs that are falling through the gaps of these schemes. One of these, crucially, are freelancers and self-employed people who operate through limited companies, who rely on dividend income actually as the main source of their income, and really through no fault of their own, simply because they use this legal mechanism to operate their business. They have not been able to secure meaningful government support packages, unlike, for example, self-employed people who are operating as sole traders, who have been able to utilize the self-employment income support scheme. The government needs to do something about this now, especially as this period of strong lockdown is going to continue for a significant period of time. It's really quite strange why the government hasn't actually been willing to help this group of people. We and other business organizations have been putting them under huge pressure over the last 6-9 months or more to do something. One avenue for helping this group of directors is through local authority schemes, local authority grants and funding. And this is where the IOD has actually been pushing recently. And there was actually an interesting development yesterday which occurred, which is that the Northern Ireland government actually announced that it was introducing a grants support scheme for the directors of limited companies. So directors of these companies in Northern Ireland will be able to apply for grants of up to £3,500 by the end of the scheme. And I suppose our message to government now is, if Northern Ireland can do this, why can't the rest of the UK, why can't the English regions do this for their limited company directors, and also, you know, the other devolved nations? So we're certainly going to be, you know, putting pressure there, as well as these groups that have fallen between the cracks. We also, I think, need to be aware that there is an impending cliff edge which is approaching. In terms of these business support measures. Many of them will be ending either at the end of March or the end of April. And the furlough scheme, for example, will conclude in April. And I suppose the question is, are we just going to fall off a cliff? Or do we need some kind of off-ramp for companies to provide a process of adjustment whereby they can get back to a more normal business environment? So I think we're going to be looking very carefully there, particularly, I think, for the frontline sectors during this crisis. It's really been apparent, hasn't it, during this crisis, how actually selective to some extent this pandemic has been in terms of how it's hit particular companies, particular sectors, particular geographies. And of course, it's the service sector that's borne the brunt, particularly in areas like leisure, retail and hospitality. And for them at the moment, they're absolutely in the midst of, you know, life or death situation. And it's going to be incredibly important to get grants through for them to extend things like the business rates holiday, making sure that continues going forward. Whereas, you know, there are actually a lot of companies out there in other sectors, particularly larger companies as well, which are actually have done relatively well during the crisis. You know, if you run an online business, if you've been in the supermarket sector, if you've been in the pharmaceutical sector or life sciences sector, it's actually been quite a good crisis. And so that they're looking at the world in a very different way. So we have to find a route map out of this crisis for the people that are really affected. But what about then when we start to move forward? What are the longer term prospects for the economy? Well, I think it's very difficult to predict at the moment, because there are positive signs and negative signs. On the negative front, I think, you know, the economy and business is going to bear the scars of the pandemic and the crisis for some time to come. There's a real issue of corporate indebtedness. I think, you know, a lot of companies, due to pure survival instinct, have taken out a lot of debt, whether that be on commercial terms or through government-backed schemes, and that potentially could be a real brake on the recovery. And I think it is going to be a task for government to restructure that debt. I mean, it's how they will do that. I think there are many ideas which are being put forward. Maybe these debts need to be converted in some way into grants, or in some way be related to a company's capacity to pay. The government has extended, for example, in terms of the bounce back loans, has extended the repayments periods from 6 years to 10 years. But even so, that will be an ongoing burden of debt around companies, and this needs to be restructured in a significant way. I think another challenge is going to be, how do we reskill and retrain the people that have lost their jobs during the crisis, particularly from the worst affected sectors, and get these people into the sectors of the future, the growth sectors. And there's going to be a need there, I think, for government and business to work hard, hand in hand, to retrain these people, give them relevant skills, vocational skills. Now, the government is about to announce a new white paper on further education reform, whereby it will propose a much closer partnership between colleges of further education and business in terms of defining training priorities. And of course, the making the current apprenticeship scheme work will be also an important part of that. But that I think is going to be very important for the long-term recovery. And I think also there's going to be a need for governments to start shifting to taking a more longer term approach to how it works with business. Thus far, we've had a very short-term approach, a kind of reactive approach to the crisis. And what will be needed going forward, I think, is much more of a strategic approach. And around 70% of IOD members actually do support the idea of some kind of industrial strategy, which should be put in place by the government, which identifies priorities for sectors and puts together a package of selective interventions to help those sectors move forward. Another, I think, big theme of the kind of build of moving back from recovery is going to be emphasis on green growth. I mean, that's a theme which the government has taken off, and of course has particular resonance as we move towards the big COP26 climate event, which is going to be happening in Glasgow later this year. And really, I suppose the issue there is, how do we connect all the commitments which government has made through the Paris Agreement and through international treaties, and also its own commitments for the UK to become net zero by 2050? How do we connect those kind of high level commitments with what is actually changing on the ground in terms of company behavior? And things there that I think that will be important. I mean, one is there is proposed a big shake-up, a change in how companies report on climate change. And what I think will be very important there is that we have a common standard and approach to this. The government is proposing that we use the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework, the TCFD framework, as a common approach to report on this. So I think that will be very important. Now, just in terms of the more day-to-day way in which we approach work, we approach business, that of course has yet really to be thought out. We were giving some thought to it, weren't we, several months ago, when it seemed like we were over the worst of the pandemic and the emphasis was very much on how do we persuade people back into the office. But that of course we've gone one step forward and then of course now 3 steps back. And that's going to be a very important question. How do we get people back into the office? But how will actually our ways of working change in this new environment? I think most people are saying that in many types of office work, there will hopefully be a move to a more of a hybrid type of approach, which blends virtual working with in-office working. But a lot of more thought, I think, needs to be given to this. If we do have people back in the office, does that mean that we're going to be back in the office at the same time or at different times? If we're back on different days, what does that imply for the quality of teamwork and interaction? How can we regain the creativity and the motivation which being together and working together brings, especially I think for younger members of staff who benefit from that interaction? If, on the other hand, to throw away the tremendous advantages and connectivity which a greater use of electronic and technological mechanisms of communication has given us, that would seem not to be the future either. So I think in each particular workplace there is a real need to think about how that's going to work. I do know from the IOD perspective, many directors have found it beneficial in many respects and improved their productivity hugely, to be able to have online board meetings and online shareholder meetings as well. But there is, I think, what I've also observed and what many people say to me, that there is a real challenge in terms of motivating many members of staff who are just left alone by themselves to operate. And you almost have to schedule the small talk, the chit chat, which previously just happened automatically. You have to actually compensate for that by touching base with people on a much more regular basis if you're managing groups of teams. And then a final point that I wanted to sort of touch on now is moving forward with our trade arrangements, and because, of course, a monumental change which occurred, which was agreed on the 24th of December, of course, and which came into effect on the 1st of January, is that we now have our trade agreement with the EU. I think, business as a whole, we've received this positively. It was certainly a much better outcome than the alternative, which was to leave the EU transition period with no deal whatsoever. And perhaps it's been the case that many companies were waiting for some kind of deal to be agreed before they implemented much of their preparation, because how do you prepare for something that you don't actually know what is going to be the outcome? So now many companies are faced with the fact that this is not, by getting a trade deal, it's not business as usual. It's actually still nonetheless a very different scenario, with a lot of documentation required, a lot of bureaucracy required in order for us to trade with the EU. People are saying, well, they're breathing a sigh of relief that perhaps the build up on the motorway in Kent, post 1st of January hasn't been as bad as people expected. Of course, we did have the pre-New Year hiccup with huge problems in transport infrastructure there. Maybe that was a kind of test run which helped us deal with the situation better post 1st of January. But what is emerging, I think, is that there clearly are issues that many companies are facing in terms of keeping the supply chains going, particularly, I think, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That seems to be emerging. But I'm, without wanting in any way to downplay the challenges of that, I do think that business is resilient, business is adaptable, and they will come to deal with that. And I think we have to recognize that there is, I think, an overwhelming appetite in business to move on now. I mean, regardless of what our individual attitudes to Brexit were, it's something which has split us down the middle, isn't it, as a country. I think now there is a general feeling, well, we do need to move on. It is reality. It has happened, and there are certain ways in which we may be able to take a benefit and take advantage of Brexit in terms of our business approach, in terms of having more of a global orientation. Whether we want to get into the business of a kind of regulatory, deregulatory competition with the EU is another matter. I know that there have been proposals put forward just in the last few days as mooted proposals of a kind of deregulatory measures, particularly relating to employment conditions, which the government is considering. I'm not sure that, from what I hear from my members, that business really wants to get into this. Of course, for one reason, could lead to retaliation from the EU, and there's a need. I think there's a feeling that we want these new arrangements to bed in, and just stabilize our relationship with the EU. There may be certain areas where I think maybe we can take a slightly different approach, and there are reviews going on at the moment of the UK listing rules. Can we actually create listing rules whereby we can attract companies to the UK stock market, innovative companies, high growth companies, which will find London an attractive place to list in? And indeed, UK companies will find the stock market a good place to do business. And that there's another review which is going on currently about the regulatory framework surrounding fintech, which again, may be an area where the UK can be more agile, more responsive to recent technological developments, to make the UK an attractive place to do business in that sector. So I think it's going to be more about better, more nimble regulation, rather than just a sort of simplistic approach, just simply to deregulation. So in terms of the overall prospects, there are some positive tea leaves present, I think. There's a lot of pent-up demand in the economy. We've done some work looking at how retail deposits have changed over the pandemic, and they're actually significantly higher for the average household in the UK. If you've managed to keep your job, if you haven't been in one of the frontline sectors, there are deposits there, there are resources there, there's pent-up demand there for consumption, We still see the housing market as being very buoyant, stock market. If confidence can return to the economy, if the kind of animal spirits can return, then there could be scope for companies to start investing, for consumers to start spending, which could be positive for the economy. But it depends crucially, I think, on that confidence being nurtured, and we wouldn't want to see, for example, business taxation being increased as we go into this recovery. The Treasury must resist the temptation to try and address the deficit at this point. I mean, yes, we need to address the deficit and the public finances in the medium term, but for the time being, business needs all the help it can get. Well, with that, maybe we could remove the slide now, and with that, I think I will turn over to you all to see if anyone has any observations or questions.
Brilliant, thanks, Roger. Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of echoing what we know government has done, which we know has been a significant package, but I think really importantly, we mustn't forget that group of directors and actually newly self-employed that are still missing from that package. Really key and kind of quite crucial that it's dealt with in this latest round of review. And that's one of the questions, interestingly, that has popped up first in the Q&A session, and I can respond afterwards if you like, in terms of what we're working as well, say in the same way the IOD are, the FSB, in terms of what we think we can do to help those directors. So what the question is what actually is being done, Roger, to put pressure on the government for grant support schemes? In many cases, the damage has already been done, especially if you're in that direct dividend space.
Very true. Yeah, maybe let me provide a bit of background to what happened. I mean, it was very obvious from the when all of the initial schemes were announced, this group of people were being left out. And in all our lobbying with the government, the answer came back from the government. We can't distinguish between dividends which are being received for the purposes of income, as opposed to dividends which are a kind of return on capital, which we don't want to support. We never found that very persuasive, but the Treasury were adamant that they couldn't use the tax and welfare system to provide a scheme in the way that they had done for sole trader self-employment support. So I suppose the approach since then has been to take a two-pronged approach. The approach which the FSB has pursued, which we have fully supported, is to say there is actually a scheme that you could do centrally based on trading income of limited companies, just percentage of trading income in the same way as the self-employed scheme. Our approach has been to say, well, okay, we don't understand why you can't offer a central scheme, but if you can't, do it through local authorities, provide them with a grant so that they can actually provide direct grants to those companies that have fallen through the gaps. I have to say, I think it's a latter approach which is working now, because we saw a week or so ago, Rishi Sunak did provide a 590 million fund to local authorities, which I'm hoping that they're going to use to help these kind of directors. It's not ring fenced and it's not adequate. It needs to be significantly increased. So we're putting on pressure to the government to do that. But as I say, at Northern Ireland have actually, have stepped forward and shown real leadership here. And I'm very proud of our chief economist, Tej Parikh, who worked with them on this scheme. They're offering a dedicated scheme for limited company directors. And so what I would say is we need to put pressure at both central government to provide more resources for these schemes that are ring fenced, and also on local authorities to follow the Northern Ireland example. Do a cut and paste now, in Scotland and the English regions to implement this scheme around the country. And that's what we'll be pushing for.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roger. No, it's great to kind of get some confidence that business organisations like the IOD, FSB are, we really are making sure that the voice of directors who've been forgotten, is heard, really. We know that it's an important area that we know we have to keep lobbying on, and I think you're right. The fact that we've already got, a successful scheme being rolled out regions in Northern Ireland, then you know, even if they kind of piggyback part of that scheme, let's get
there's no excuse.
done.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Brilliant. I'm just quickly looking at the Q&A. I know some questions popped up in the chat box, not the Q&A. So I'll quickly review that. I've got another one, and then if not, then I will ask some of the questions I was jotting down. Let me go here. So yes, we've got a question from Sue Nelson. Every accountant recommends you take a minimum salary and then the rest is dividends, but only when you're profitable do the dividends kick in. Could we get help? Oh yes, is your address below? Could we then get help? Yes. Could we have your comments on that, Roger?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I started in this current job actually in September, and prior to that, I had spent 4.5 years running my own consulting firm through a limited company. And you know, when I launched my limited company, I asked my accountants to do an analysis of the tax efficiency of operating as a sole trader versus the tax efficiency of being a limited company. There was no real difference. There was no real difference. And so the idea that you choose limited company as some kind of tax avoidance measure is just incorrect. And of course, what my accountant advised me also to do was to take a small salary up to the national insurance threshold, which is what I'm sure many limited company directors have done. But of course, we now find ourselves in the situation where we can get minimal support. I mean, of course, we could furlough ourselves and receive furlough support based on that small monthly salary, but that is a minimal amount of money, and it may actually create problems, because if you're furloughed, and you're still trying to operate your company, how are you? Is that falling within the rules? You know, with the furlough, generally speaking, has restrictions in the sort of work that you can do. And I've always felt that the government never really clarified that, and it's a very grey area. So it's just it's simply unfair, and I think I reached a situation as the IOD. We reached a situation where we were continually bringing this up to ministers and civil servants, and at a certain point, you know, their kind of eyes were glazing over. We're not going to do this. We're not going to. There was almost like some sort of philosophical reason, whereby they didn't want to help this group. But I think what has now given it renewed impetus is just the fact that we've gone into the public health situation. We've just, obviously, this is going to go on for longer and is going to be tougher than we ever would have expected. And so that's why I think now we have renewed impetus to do something for these people. And I've never been able to work out why they can't actually deliver a centralized scheme. It's like the one advocated by the FSB. But if you're not going to do it that way, just give local authorities a slush fund and let them help these directors.
Yeah, I think one of the comments that we had from local authority previously was that if central government devolved it down to local, and central government was saying it's in the too difficult pile, so we don't really know what to do with it, we give it to local authorities. And actually local authorities are struggling even more in terms of resources to allocate and work out the scheme themselves. So I think there'd been a bit of a kickback from local authorities as well to that scheme. So it's almost as if the business organisations need to present a cut and paste scheme, as you said, to government to say this is what would work. Just get on and do it. So
yes.
As the comments that we've had, that if your turnover is below a certain level, if you haven't been able to use the income support element or furlough yourself, then you've had nothing. You really haven't. So as long as we continue to
yes.
make sure that the voice is heard and that we need to do more, because basically at the moment everything we've done to date hasn't resulted in a package. So it's really, if we can shape that package,
yes,
that's, I think, the best way that we can make a difference for the small businesses.
Yes, there is. I think the other way in which we should move forward on also is making the case for governments to convert a lot of the loans, the government-backed loans that limited companies have taken out and others, convert them to grants. So because at the moment that's been the lifeline, I suppose, for many limited companies that they have they've benefited, or they've sought to access these state-backed loans. And yes, good that they were there and they provided a lifeline, but they're potentially going to be a millstone around the neck of people. So as an additional measure, I think we need to work to get the government to convert them into grants.
Yeah, brilliant. Now we are meant to be going back to the main room. Thank you, Roger, for that. But one more question has popped up. I think we've probably got time to answer just that one question. Do you see new opportunities arising from the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area that can help businesses to deal with Africa as one unit?
Well, I'm not an expert on that specific deal, but I think in the post-Brexit period, what we are noticing from our members is that they are now starting to perhaps look beyond Europe, and they are starting to take more of a global orientation, and that's something I think we should encourage. And Africa, as a continent, offers great opportunity. I mean, there is the business, I think, will need help, and that's a role that the business organizations can play so that businesses can understand what's involved in exporting or doing business with these countries, and will have help to make the right connections. But I think we should see now the post-Brexit era as a global opportunity. This is now global Britain. It's a bit of a cliche, but it is an opportunity, and so let's make the most of it.